Thank you for listening to the North Carolina Food and Beverage Podcast, coming to you from the cozy comforts of our palatial homes. I'm Max's next-door neighbor, Brian Hoyle, and your host for the evening. They're here, your busy backyard bartenders, the masters of the takeout menu, the homeschooling, home distancing, Max Trujillo and Matthew Weiss.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the North Carolina Food and Beverage Podcast. I am your co-host, Max Trujillo.
And I am your co-host, Matthew Weiss. And today we venture into the cloud. We are going to talk with the founder and the partner of one of my favorite importers of fine wine in this country, period. We talk to also the author of To Burgundy and Back Again, Mr. Roy Cloud. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Matt.
And partner in Vintage 59, Mr. Michael Daniels. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here, guys. Max and I were discussing before the show and how this relates to North Carolina and how this relates to our world right now. A couple of things just for people listening that might not recognize Vintage 59, although of course you do. Well, you've heard Deb Lewis, who's listening in today on our show before, and she is one of the national sales managers for Vintage 59. She lives locally in Durham. You've probably drank a good amount of Vintage 59 wine at either one of Mike Lee's restaurants in Durham or Van Rouge or St. James or all over North Carolina for that matter. But also your business, your importer, represents a big microcosm of what's going on not only in North Carolina, but in the wine business right now. So just to set this up, Roy, let's get into a little bit about you and your background. You somehow went to Hampshire College, then got a Master's of Arts in English Lit and Writing, and transitioned that into a wine career. How does that happen?
Matt, you didn't even reference that it was NYU, your alma mater.
That's right.
What's going on?
It was a torturous path, Matt. No, but I was a carpenter out on the West Coast after college, and then I went to NYU to do the writing thing. And while I was at NYU, I was working in wine bars in Manhattan. This is back in 84, 85. So I got really into wine at that time, although I was already into wine prior to this, during college, even in high school. When I finished NYU, I went down to D.C., to live in Washington, D.C., because my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, lived here. And I couldn't really pay the rent writing. So I took a job at MacArthur Liquors, which I knew about because Paul Parker at the time, who was God, he wrote about MacArthur Liquors. And so I started working retail. And one thing led to another.
From working retail, you worked your way up to becoming a buyer of California wines, and was that because of your passion and writing skills, that you were writing shelf talkers and stuff like that, or how did you ascend so quickly?
No, in fact, the store was a bit more dysfunctional than that. They needed an American wine buyer, and I rose to the occasion, and I became that person, and I was there for a very long time, and after a bit, it became a very frustrating job for me. And so when I was offered this job to start an import company, I jumped at it, although I really had no real qualifications to do the job.
Can we jump into that story real quick? Because from what I read, it was Domaine Michel Schlumberger, who was starting an import company. They're Sonoma-based winery, and then they pegged you somehow as a Washington, D.C. local to help them as like a job finding service to put candidates in front of them to curate an import book for them. And somehow that job became yours.
Exactly, yeah. The sales manager, the national sales director for Michel Schlumberger, he hatched this great idea to start up a French import company because Jacques Schlumberger was the primary partner of Michel Schlumberger, and obviously of French descent. And they were going through a massive replanting because of phylloxera. So they needed product. And the sales director thought this was a brilliant opportunity. So he asked me to set up interviews. I did that because I knew a lot of people and he knew me. And I went with him to the interviews, and they didn't really work out. And so I just, at the end of it all, I just said, well, why don't you just hire me to do this? And he thought that was a great idea. And I don't think it really was in retrospect. I didn't speak any French, know anything about distribution. But I wanted the job.
But as the story goes, I think your brother is fluent, or at least a good speaker of French. Is that correct? And he kind of came along with you on your trip?
Exactly, yeah. My brother Joe, my older brother, he went to school in France. He studied French. And when I told him I had this job and I was going to go to France and start looking for producers, he laughed. He said, "You need me." And I said, "Yeah, I think you're right."
Yeah.
So he became the invisible passenger because he was never on the expense reports.
I don't know about you, but Max, if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for people to go to France, drink some great wine, travel through, meet some great winemakers, and then, buy some wine for me to curate a list. Can you find me somebody who can do that job?"
Yeah.
Like, if they really wanted to, I would put the biggest idiots in front of them just to be like, well, you know what? I guess I'll do the job. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer, Roy.
Well, it also seems kind of calculating by them, but maybe that wasn't their initial intent. But I've been on the side of like hiring people and promoting people, and I've definitely wanted certain people, and they're like, no, I'm not ready to make that jump into management or transition. It's like, but would you help me with the process, and you'll see, and then it's like you literally have manipulated the situation where they see the process because you're helping, they're supposedly helping you, and you're like, no, I'm just taking baby steps to show you what this job really would be like. And they're like, oh, maybe I could do this. It's a good tactic, however it worked.
Well, the sales director needed someone to do this job. And because he had this, like I said, he had this idea he had hatched. And once he got me, he ticked that box.
And so, in looking at your the great article that was written about you, speaking about great writers, and you're a writer yourself, I was very impressed with the writing ability of Michael Franz that did an article on you that I checked out, and I encourage those we can put in the show notes. Importer on the Rise, back in 2007, and the article that he wrote, like he said some great things about you in the sense that you were typically into American wine until 1991, which you said was the last great American vintage from coming out of say Napa. Is that, maybe I'm a little incorrect in quoting it, but paraphrasing that you started to grow more fond of old world wines after 91. Is that kind of a better way to say it?
I would say no. I always loved old world wines from day one. I always did. But I also loved California wines. I really cut my teeth on California wines back in the day. And the quote was, or what I meant was, and I still believe this, the last really great vintage in Napa Valley until things went down, until Napa Valley took this path into making sugar bombs, was 1991. And then for a long time, for a decade or more, Napa made these, they went on a model of making wine that I really disagreed with. Yeah,
which is funny because I was challenging that thought with Matt before we got on here. I said, well, he's got like 97. That was considered a stellar year. And then 98 even was like considered a great year years later as it matured. But Matt made like a good point of saying, well, maybe that's a pure example of the things Roy was not actually excited about. And that 97 might have been like the in his mind, could have been considered the worst vintage because it was the definition of the style that was not basically what you're looking for.
I would concur with that. Although, I mean, the answer to that is actually really complex because it's where are you in Napa and how you're making a wine. It really changes. It depends on where you are and who you are.
Yeah.
But it was a very ripe year. And that was what and the whole ripe model of Napa Valley winemaking is something I disagree with. I don't like personally.
So this is a great segue into things that disagree with and agree with in terms of wine. So just to get back on that story, you get to go to France. They ended up hiring you. Your brother invites himself or you invite him. Either way, it was mutually beneficial to go with you and kind of be your translator. It's in the book, but for those people who haven't read it, how do you go about setting your path to, how do you begin to find these wineries and kind of what's your criteria at that point of what you're looking for?
Back then, it was much more difficult. Back then, everything was done by fax. now in this modern era, there's trade shows all over the place in Europe that you can go to. You can source that way. Everyone speaks English. Back then, very few people did. And in fact, so it's much slower. So, but the criteria hasn't really changed. I would just do a lot of research on a given area and write and make appointments and then go and make choices that way, and hope that some things would lead to another and so forth in that way.
When I'm talking about criteria, I mean, so for people that don't know, Vintage 59 is exclusively, I believe, family-owned domains. So I would say that maybe that was, I don't know if that kind of occurred happenstance or that was thought strategically in the beginning. And there's obviously your style of wine, as we talked about, the 91 California versus 97. Plus, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is how do you begin to curate a portfolio? And for somebody that's listening in and thinking, yeah, well, I like a certain wine, but maybe everybody else doesn't like this wine, but yet I'm in business to sell these wines. How do you manage all that when looking for wineries?
Well, I guess the answer is I'm not really a businessman. I never started this whole venture to make money. I think there are much easier ways to make money. So I really wanted to. I love agriculture. I love farmers. I grew up I was a kid. I was a farmer. My father was a farmer. I'm sorry. And so I wanted to work with small families. That was really important to me. And I wanted to work with people who I liked and who I could talk to regularly. And quickly it became clear that the person who made the wine, person behind the wine, was as important as the wine itself. And so those two criteria, the quality of the wine, the quality of the person, and it being a small family, those were drivers for me.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, okay, you're there. I mentioned at the top, you wrote a great book, To Burgundy and Back Again, and it really outlines kind of a fairy tale trip, but also hard work and this magical sort of venture through France and specifically Burgundy.
Matt, it was a terrifying trip. It was an absolutely memorial trip, but it was a terrifying trip too.
Yeah, that is true. There's multi-layer to that trip. But did you have the intention to write a book? I mean, you, like I said, you had a Master's of Arts in Writing and English Literature. So, and I said this to you previously, but in one of the reviews of the book, somebody, a critic, had said, "Oh, it's as if you were literally listening into some of the dialogue or the conversations verbatim."
I had no intention of writing a book when I started this trip. And it was 1997. In July of 97, my father and my mother, they went on a trip to France, to Burgundy, and my father had a terrible bike accident. 1 month later, I was hired to take this job or thereabouts. I don't remember the exact timing, but in October of 97, I went to France with my brother for the first trip to source wine. And so that was very much part of the whole situation. And in 2003 or thereabouts, I started to write the book. So 6 years later or so. But it was an homage to my father. It was something I could do for him because he had the accident was brain trauma, and he never recovered. And so I wrote the book for him, and I guess for my mother, and also it was about my brother and I, how we did this thing. And I guess terrifying was a strong word. What parts were terrifying? It was stressful, but it was also it was a very, very poignant 2-week travel with my brother. And we had huge highs and huge lows, and we got, very close from it. And, to this day, we talk about that.
Yeah, well, making and building a portfolio such as yourself, what you've done, it's not dissimilar to, say, like a sommelier just creating their own portfolio for a restaurant and then building the trust with your customers as saying, I know something about wine. I've studied it. I've researched it. I've also met the winemakers. I've been to their vineyards, and I've selected and chose to bring these people together because of my experience and who I am as a person. And so it's all built on trust. I mean, whatever it is, it's like why anyone's listening to our podcast is that we've built some trust with the fact that we're able to bring people that have great stories to talk to on the show, and it makes people want to hear more stories. And so it's all about building trust with each other. And so I think that's kind of like when Matt was saying, like, how are you, the criteria of how you put everything together. I think a lot of it is based on your personal attachment to the vineyards and the wineries themselves and the flavor profiles, of course, but I think it probably even stems deeper than just the flavor profiles. It's like the intent of how they're making those wines. And that's a beautiful thing too. Is there framework that you look for when, and a style that would help an audience understand, you know, in words, what your style, your portfolio kind of tends to lean towards?
Sure. Yeah. I think I like classical wines. So I like fruit, but I like freshness. I like acidity. And so classicism, I guess, is what I am, what we're known for, what our book is known for.
Yeah.
Telling those stories and talking about being champions of classicism and things that people do well, that folks do well, is happening at the Folks Foundation in North Carolina, as they are champions of all great things, North Carolina, Max.
That's right. Folks Foundation, which we've spoken about a little bit recently, is doing something really cool. They are actually producing a compilation vinyl album called The Carolina Quarantine Project, where Carolina musicians or duos are showcasing songs they're writing while being sheltered in place. And all the sales of the album go directly to the artists, and that's not uncommon for what Folks Foundation does in general, as they are a 501c3 nonprofit. They receive grants and donations and charitable monies to help support artists such as those. And especially in these trying times and people out of work and all, especially artists, those are type of businesses that, say what you will, of essential or non-essential, art is always essential in this world. And so supporting those that do that is paramount in these times, so that we can continue to not just live, but to thrive. And so support great art, and you can do that by going to folksfoundation.org or click the link in our show notes.
I do want to talk about how Vintage 59 now in your portfolio may have changed or evolved. And Mike, I want to bring you in here. And by the way, I should mention this is a good point to mention, that not only do you guys walk the walk, so to speak, in terms of classic French wines, but you also kind of help preach the gospel, and you take industry people each and every year to France to visit your properties and to really understand, as you said, Roy, to meet these people. Because if you like the people, very often, most times, you're going to like the wine. So, Mike, you were introduced to Vintage 59, and before you even get into how you came to the company, can you talk about possibly how the portfolio has evolved and how you understand and have carried on the portfolio since you've joined the company?
Sure. So I met Roy in 2005. The first trip that I ever took to France with him was in 2006. And that was the aha moment for me, where I realized that not only was I fascinated by the wines, but also the people that were behind them. You know, I realized that every single one of these wines, it wasn't just the story of the wine, it was a story of the family behind them. It was a story of the place. And the hook was set after that trip. I started thinking at that point, how can I do this for as long as possible? And I believe it was just a year later that I started running trips once or twice a year with customers. It was a couple years after that, I guess in 2008, that Deborah joined. And since then, every February, we've done a trip with basically 2 cars, 8 folks in total, trying to get to the places where these wines come from and get a close personal experience with the folks that are behind them. It's the best marketing that we can possibly do. There is nothing more important to understanding these wines than seeing the people and the places that they come from, because the people that we work with have a lot of value for the distinctiveness of what they do. You know, everything that they do is about expressing a terroir, a very particular place that couldn't be recreated someplace else. And if you can actually go and see the place, it resonates better than anything else that you could read or tell somebody else.
That is so true. Having gone to any vineyard, whether it's overseas or even domestically, when you're there, you just get a sense of like what. It's almost like you can taste the wine in the atmosphere, because you're like, oh, I see the soil. I see like how this is a cool climate. Oh, I see how the wind would have come down through these trees and through this hill. And it's like, you start to understand, when you also understand how wine is made or grown, more importantly, how grapes are grown, it really gives you that sense of place. And I think that's like the beauty of wine in general. So that's why, it's super important to get out there.
Yeah, I think if we're doing it right, the glasses that we put in front of people, there's an opportunity to take a trip in that glass. I think if we're doing it right, we're working as cultural ambassadors as much as we are just selling bottles. We're trying to show people a glimpse into a place.
Matt, do you ever feel like through sense memory, and you're a somm, but more importantly, you know wine, you can like reference it pretty easily. You ever like grab a bottle you haven't tasted from a region in a while that you visited, and when you pop it, like all your sense memory just sends you right back to that spot. Like you're like, oh, I remember my trip to Chile or wherever it might be. It's like that's really like a magical part of wine, which is pretty like hard to replicate in any other type of beverage.
I feel like when you have that experience, that means that the place and the winemaker has done their job very, very well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, and I'm playing like a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but we are in the wine business, and this is I'm always intrigued by this, because you're right. If we represent the people and the wines that we love, well, it makes our job very easy, right? They say, do something you love and you never work a day in your life. However, in this day and age of the wine business, there's so much competition out there, not to mention just the logistics. And Mike, I know you handle a lot of that, is filling containers, because in order to be profitable, you have to have enough wines on a ship to make it worth your while. And so I'm just wondering, and you can be honest or you're not, but like, have there ever been a time where you felt like, I sacrificed a little bit of quality here just to make an extra dollar, to make it logistically, financially sound? And that's a question for both you and Roy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would start out by saying that we had a colleague that we used to work with who always said that if we were really in it for the money, we'd all be selling pharmaceuticals.
Right.
This is definitely a labor of love. I think much like, people that run restaurants as well. If you don't really love the work that you're doing, it's probably not the right place to be. And in terms of making concessions to the commercial imperative, one of the reasons that I was so attracted to this company was that early on, I realized that Roy had a real commitment representing wines that he believed in, and let the commercial side of things take care of itself. That he was convinced that if we're going to put a back label on a wine that says Vintage 59, it should mean something. It should mean that it's a bottle that we want to take home and that we want to drink and that we really believe in. And in the early days, that was really challenging. I have to say there was times that I thought, well, this is something maybe that we could sell, and we need to kind of build the portfolio out. And Roy was always really uncompromising, I think, about making sure that if it were our back label, it was something that we believed in. And I've come to believe that that's not only a good way to work, but commercially in the long run, maybe one of the most valuable things that we offer.
There's a lot of integrity in that. How ironic, though, from a guy that only took French, even though you speak it very well, just to pick up ladies.
It's so true. So true about Mike Daniels.
That was just a neighbor's piece of advice that nudged me over the edge.
Yeah, this is just a little carrot dangle. No, but
I think that argument though can be, we're talking about versus restaurants and even wine, but there's the side of business that's money making and calculating and kind of without a soul, but is a big machine that can bring in dollars, and that holds true for many restaurants out there like wine companies. But then there are ones that are kind of more focused on an art driven, purposeful artisan, an integrity style of business, and that's, I think, the big separator, right? I mean, kudos to you for being a company that works towards being artistic while trying to make a dollar in this world.
Yeah, actually, along those lines, Roy, I'm curious to ask also, when you were doing the California Barrel program and you were sort of there as Napa was changing, could you feel that cynicism sort of creeping into the whole process when you were there?
What I saw was Bob Parker had so much power, and people really, really looked up to him, and that was a power structure that wasn't healthy at all. So I saw that, and I guess they started making wines for him to some real extent for his taste, which more and more he got more and more into. I don't know. There's a joke that some people in the wine business, they evolve and they become acid heads, and others devolve and become sugar bomb heads. And some people say that Bob Parker devolved. I don't really know if that's true or not, but he had great power, and that wasn't healthy. And then this whole saw movement started and all that, and that was really encouraging at first because these guys had their own points of view, and that was a healthy return.
And so, how does that work in the wine business today, especially in the wine world today? I mean, there's so much going on in terms of, and we've talked about it before, and we'll get into the tariff situation, the situation in North Carolina. As you guys know, they've gone to bottle one pricing, so there's no volume discounts. And then with huge wholesalers and distributors, and I feel like I keep talking about business, but it's you guys are almost an anomaly at this point. Not that there aren't other companies like you, but it's almost like a shining beacon of small, integral business with integrity, and yet all these huge corporate conglomerate wholesalers come around and are trying to eat up all of the smaller wholesalers and distributors. So how do you protect yourselves in this environment?
Go ahead, Mike. I think you have a good answer there.
I think that the way that it works, as you guys know, every state is different in the United States. Each state has the ability to regulate alcohol distribution within their borders. And what that means is that every single state is different. And it's really a Byzantine structure to navigate for a company like ours. And so, a lot of the stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis as an organization is compliance and making sure that we are doing things the right way. And so state by state, there's different realities. In the states where there's the most control, what ends up happening is that at one end of the spectrum, you have an exploding number of quality producers around the world. And you have an exploding number of interesting restaurants and consumers that are developing a wine culture here in the United States. And between the two, you have a limited number of distributors. People talk about the industry as being shaped like an hourglass with all the suppliers on one side, the customers on the other, and distributors in the middle that have the ability to have a stranglehold on things. In those markets, it's a real challenge for us. And the only way that we're able to do it is by dint of hard work. And, Deborah's on the line here. I mean, the work that she does to actually, get out and do hand-to-hand work of tasting wines and presenting them to customers and really fighting tooth and nail for every bit of business that we do is the only way that it's possible in those places.
Would you say that there's almost kind of like a subculture of your audience versus, say, the audience that you may never crack into, meaning like the big national accounts? I mean, you probably still sell to national accounts, but I mean to that level.
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to sell wine to Trader Joe's, for example, we don't have a single producer that makes enough wine to actually satisfy or apply for one of those placements. So it just there's a different world, and what we do, seeking things that are distinctive and small and limited, is almost antithetical to the scalable big business stuff that we see in other parts of the industry, and trying to navigate that. It means finding good distributors that are capable of doing both things, and then it means working really hard in those markets to, at the ground level, develop customer relationships and interest in the wines that we're bringing in. In other markets where there's less control, I think in Washington D.C. you could start a distribution business out of your garage tomorrow if you wanted to with limited paperwork. In other markets,
noted,
where there's less regulation, the pendulum swings both ways, and I think that sometimes as the bigger companies get bigger, there's opportunities for people that are distinctive and different from that. And, in California, we actually work as a distributor as well. We have a sales team out there. And we found that buyers are really, really happy to see people that come through the door, and the only thing that they're selling are products that they really believe in. They don't, our reps don't have big volume commitments for large corporate producers that they have to hit. And that's a pressure that's really hard to balance for people on the ground. And so I like to think that the pendulum swinging back and forth and some companies getting bigger actually creates opportunities for folks like us.
And also, great. Matt, I mean, everyone wants to believe in something authentic, and we have that, and so that helps a lot.
Yeah, I just can't help but think about it. You put it in the thought of the consumer, because ultimately, they're the ones who are, as they say, voting with their dollars. We had Sebastian Zuccardi, who's a Mendoza winemaker, on last week, however the timing goes. And one of the things that he said that I think resonates so well, and one of the things that inspires me about this business, he said, there are wineries that go out into the market, see what is needed, and then they make wines accordingly to fill that need or fill that glitch. And then there's wineries that see what their terroir does, their land does, what is well produced there. And then they go out into the market and talk about why this is important. And obviously you guys fall into that model.
I think so. One of the things that we have actually joked about over the years is that we like producers that when we go to visit, drink a lot of their own wine. Mm-hmm. Years ago, a producer that will remain unnamed in California, I was talking to at a tasting, and he sort of laughed and he said, "I don't drink this stuff, but I sell out every year." And
that's not an uncommon phrase. I've known many California winemakers that are like, "I drink Burgundy, man. That's what but I make this."
Yeah, I make right. A lot of money selling this stuff, and then I buy something else.
Well, that's kind of a good transition too, because we're talking about quality versus just business, and I think that all kind of makes sense. And given that, the beginning of the year before quarantines happened and all that, we were talking about tariffs. We were talking about how this was just going to kind of really adversely affect the wine world. And some of those things have kind of have been paused, and some things are coming back. But there's already been an increase in international wines and kind of old world wines, if you will. And now, as Matt and I were just having kind of a pre-discussion before this podcast started, we're obviously going to be in a major financial predicament at this point. And it makes you think back to the financial crisis of like 07, 08. And you look at parallels and you see like who won, sadly to say, but like who came out of it best. And I was a distributor at the time. I was working for Kendall Jackson, and I was working in California for Regal Wines, which is a distributor created by Kendall Jackson. And the whole purpose of that was like, Kendall Jackson can get into all of these accounts, they can't get into those accounts. So let's get a cool book that can help spread the growth of that. And we start preaching the gospel of the KJ wines, all California coastal, while we're also selling cool brands like Lioco or whatever. But what we noticed in that whole financial crisis was the Vintners Reserve Chardonnay from Kendall Jackson. It's fairly bulletproof in the market. It was like something like number one selling wine for 28 years or 40 years, whatever it is at this point. I've been removed for about 7 years now. But it was starting to chip away. The armor was starting to chip away during that time because bigger companies selling less expensive wine, the Gallows, the Barefoots, the Yellowtails, were increasingly going up. Their revenue was going up because people were buying cheaper wine. And so in this scenario, cheaper wine might simply just mean domestic wine if we're attacking all of these old world wines and wines that you guys hold so dear, that we all in the wine world hold so dear. So how does that work moving forward? And do you guys have you thought about that, because of pricing and availability and what the market is actually going to want going forward?
Yeah, it's a tough situation right now. You are right. With the pandemic, the trends are people are buying much less expensive wines. We are rethinking all of our pricing structures right now.
Which is unfortunate because it's not like you're buying wines from farmers that are just loaded and are going to feel good about either them taking a decrease in commission and you taking a decrease in commission, so that we can sell these same wines that were valued at probably a fair price to begin with, and probably just enough margin to keep all the lights on in all the various chains that the chinks in the chain that keep the business running. Now we're saying we got to find more room in that profit to become more accessible into the market. And that's sad and unfair that's the way it works. And then that's where companies, I was saying to Matt, it's parallel to the beer industry in that the big companies are now merging with each other to become even bigger. And that's why, like, if you buy any beer that's not just from your local brewery, it's pretty much run by either Anheuser-Busch or Miller Coors for the most part, or Foster's, whatever. It's pretty much that. And so the wine industry is becoming that as well. So you guys, back when I worked for the big companies, we'd look at these brands and go, oh, these are like the little boutiques, the ankle biters, the smaller ones. When in fact, these are the guys that actually had all the real good stuff. And you guys existed because of quality. Now we run into this problem of how important is quality to the consumer when they just want to have a glass of wine at the end of the day. And I think that's where we're all kind of at, and like figuring out, like, we can't just allow it to for many of these brands to go away. We got to work with it, and we got to figure out how we can keep all of these fantastic wineries moving forward.
Yeah, I think the big challenge is, how do we get the wine to those consumers who still have the wherewithal to not worry too much about the price? And there's two groups of consumers. There's the ones who are really, really hurting because they lost their jobs, and then there are the ones who are not going on vacation because they cannot go on vacation, and they're saving a lot of money, so therefore they're happy to spend it on wine.
Yeah. I think there's two thoughts that occur to me. The current situation with tariffs, and also with the current economic crisis from COVID. At the end of the day, I've joked with Roy over the years that we're really just glorified currency traders. Pretty much everything that we buy is in euros. And there was a period where the euro was trading at almost $1.60 to a single euro, which was much more of an impact than the 25% tariff that's in place right now. It's not to take away from the seriousness of it, but it's the sort of thing that I think that I hope a company like ours can weather. And we're small and hopefully nimble enough that we can pivot and work around. We have a lot of trust with our producers also, so we can work closely with them to try to make sure that we can sell their product in whatever way. But for certain producers, for certain individual producers, those changes can be catastrophic. I mean, if you're presenting a Sancerre that you can pour by the glass in restaurants all over the country, and then all of a sudden this tariff hits and it tips it above a point that restaurants can justify doing that, it can have a really, 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 really devastating impact for some of those producers. So far, fortunately, that hasn't been the case, but it's a real threat.
Getting back to wine, one of the things that I loved about our trip and that stuck out with me back in France was obviously you guys represent the Champagne Jacques Son, and Jean-Hervé Chiquet, when we were talking about drinking wines, was in all the things he was talking about, said, oh yeah, I met with Melanie and we talked about this, or, and he's talking about with all of your other producers and all other great winemakers, and sort of they're picking each other's brains and getting great advice. So what I want to know is, what is the next great French region, or is there anything else in France that you guys are looking for?
Before tariffs came down?
Yeah, before a pre-COVID world or a post-COVID world, however you want to look at it.
No, I was thinking about Savoie. That would be it's a fascinating area. But I don't think it's the next new big thing, but it's just a fascinating area up in the Alps. In France.
Yeah, you guys don't have a Savoie producer at this point.
No, we don't.
Yeah. Some great Jacquard would be great, or some Mondus. That'd be good. Mike, what about you? I know you're always up on the trade publications and knowing what's some of the best stuff that you're reading about or interested to dive into.
I don't know when the fascination with all of the changes and excitement that's going on in Champagne is going to stop. I mean, there is no signs of slowing. The current economic turmoil aside, what people are doing qualitatively both at houses and amongst growers in Champagne. I mean, when we travel from one year to the next, the tangible feeling of excitement and the quality of the wines every year that passes continues to get better and more interesting and more distinctive. People are rediscovering terroir in a lot of places in Champagne. And to me, that is, I mean, for now, endlessly fascinating.
It is so true. Once you dive down that rabbit hole of Champagne, it's really hard to come back.
Well, I was going to say, harkening back to something we were talking about before, also about the cost of wines. Just because something's good also doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be expensive. And I think that there's still certain wines that we represent and that are coming out of France that even with tariffs and even after having been imported are some of the best buys in the world. And Great Muscadet continues to be, especially this time of year, one of the most exciting wines out there. I mean, they can be just absolutely succulent, delicious wines with really distinctive personalities. And you can get good bottles for $15 or $20. I think that there's a lot of places like that in France. Trying to seek those things out, I think, is what we definitely are trying to do now.
And that's also a great point because the Muscadet you guys represent, the Main Brangère, they are not only bringing you this amazing Muscadet classic. You can buy it for like around $15 retail, just to give people maybe even 12, somewhere between 12 and 15. But they have many tiers of their Muscadet, and not only that, but they're really, at the same time of being classicists, they're redefining the region and experiencing their terroir into building crews in the area and to see what the best of their terroir can bring in single bottlings, which I think is another thing that probably, or I'm going to assume that maybe you're looking for, is ways that we're exploring classic regions in new ways.
And the place that you could get those wines, talking about great places to shop and possibly find brands that are curated by distributors such as Vintage 59 and other great artistic portfolios, go to the Triangle Wine Company, where they have 4 locations. They're a proud sponsor of the NCF&B podcast, and they sell a lot of wine. I was asking Matt, it sounds like they sell a pretty good amount of Vintage 59 wines over at the Triangle Wine Company, which is great. You can go to trianglewineco.com. They have 4 locations. They have delivery. They have online purchasing. They have curbside pickup, all the things that would keep you from purchasing. They figured it out. So it's a great thing. So you can go to trianglewineco.com and get your wine there.
Yeah. And when you're at Triangle Wine Co., you can also look at the back label of Vintage 59 and find something that Mr. Roy Cloud has written himself. Roy, just to get out of here and finish this, you still write all the back labels to the wines. Correct?
I do. And it was always one of the founding factors of the whole company, was that back in 1997, we were going to have a label that told the story of the wine, of the appellation, of the people in 500 characters or less. And characters included spaces.
Right.
So real discipline. And I had an old editor who was an old printer press guy who was my editor, Jim Robertson. And he was a screamer. And I would write a draft. He would read it. He would critique it. I would rewrite it. And he would pick up the phone and scream at me because I did something we didn't talk about. And then he'd hang up on me. And he'd call back in 2 minutes later and apologize for screaming at me, and then scream at me again because I made him scream at him, and he would hang up. But it was a great discipline. He was a great teacher. And he was the man who created the Ridge label. He designed the Ridge label, 50 odd years ago.
Oh, wow.
One of the most enduring labels in all of American wine.
That's from my hometown. I'm from San Jose in the Saratoga Hills area. I rode my bike past the Ridge every weekend. That was my ride. That's a beautiful Paul Draper, great winemaker at the time.
I was going to say, you could call Paul Draper one of the godfathers of American winemaking for sure.
Yeah, because even coming up as a young wine person, was always told, where's the quickest and easiest way to learn something about a wine? It's on the back label. But that answer typically was dependent on how important the distributor or the winemaker was in the process of the packaging. And so sometimes you look on the back and it just says, red fruit, big, bold. You're like,
eat with chicken.
That did not tell me much.
Chicken.
But What Matt's alluding to is, man, there are some very articulate and very informative informative things to say on a back of a vintage 59 label, which is really cool. And it does help like the server or the person on the shelf looking at things kind of understand why they want to buy that. And thank you for taking attention to that type of detail, because that is the last place that you get to speak to your audience, which is great.
Yeah. So I think, Roy, you might want to call Twitter, because you might have been the impetus for the whole 500 character limit. So maybe you're owed a royalty or something like that.
Okay. But I mean, the thing about wine is a window into a culture. And if you can encapsulate that in a back label in some shape or form, it's a great thing. Yeah.
And we've talked about that before on the podcast. So it's like a pro tip. If you don't know that much, or you're a little bit intimidated by the knowledge and the whole spectrum of wine, start to realize that if you see a logo of an importer on the back of a wine label, well, that's typically associated with quality, or a symbol that this is going to be a quality product. So if you see vintage 59 on the back of the label, you know that it's going to be a good wine. One last thing before we get out of here, gentlemen. And Mike, I know you're deeply involved, and just to take it back 1 second, what do we think after COVID is going to be the future of these tariff situations? I believe, Mike, you lobbied to the United States Trade Representative, and I just want to know where we stand right now and kind of what your best guess is for the future of that.
My understanding is that where we stand right now is status quo, which is that there is a 25% ad valorem tariff on a lot of wines coming out of the EU. Our expectation is that that's with us to stay. Our attitude is to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But we expect that that's probably going to be with us to stay for some time. Once tariffs go into place, there needs to be a pretty strong political will to repeal them. Now, obviously, there's much bigger issues facing all of us. So we're still working really hard to work in the context where they're going to be around for a while.
I think it's important to note, if I can jump in there, it's really important to understand that there's tariffs and there's tariffs. This is not a tariff on steel. This is not a tariff levied against China and all that. This is levied against the EU, arising out of a dispute with Airbus and Boeing. And wine was picked as an easy target. And it became quite clear early on that the Federal Trade Commission, having chosen agricultural products to tariff, didn't realize what they were really doing. They didn't realize how the three-tiered system in America worked and how it really, really hurt restaurants and hospitality industry and distributors, and how even 95%, even more, of the U.S. domestic wine production people out there are against the tariffs because they understand it hurts their distribution networks. So there is some hope that maybe these tariffs could remain in place, but on different products. But it's still some time away.
And are we clear or out of the woods in terms of, because I know that it was agreed upon there was sort of a stay on the 100% tariffs which were proposed, but are we clear of that now? Is that not going to happen?
Well, they're two separate disputes. The original tariff had to do with the dispute between Boeing and Airbus that had been adjudicated in the WTO over the course of, I think, 14 years. And a decision came down that Airbus had been guilty of, or the EU had been guilty of subsidies to Airbus that were not approved by the WTO. And as a result, there was this punitive tariff that was put in place. That's the 25%. The 100% had to do with a tech dispute and had to do with individual member states in the EU, particularly France, targeting large tech companies for taxes, basically taxing their revenues in France. And France unilaterally started to unilaterally put a tax in place at the same time that there was multilateral negotiations going on. And that was seen as a huge threat. And so there was this threat of 100% tariffs on any number of wines out of France. Fortunately, that was resolved and appears to be resolved for the time being as these multilateral negotiations continue. Everything I've heard is that those are continuing apace. We can only hope for our part that they're successful.
Well, let's hope that stays at bay for the time being, considering we're trying to figure out the rest of the economy as we rebuild.
Yeah, and in talking about the economy and where we are right now, just to jump back just a second. Roy was talking about the three-tier system, but by most estimates, for every dollar that's spent here in the United States on a bottle of imported wine, 75 to 90 cents of it stays here in the United States. Between importers like us, distributors like Weinbo Matt, retailers that are actually making those sales, restaurants that are making those sales, the economic impact is almost entirely here in the United States. And at a time that we're suffering from all of these, external shocks and whatnot, it's a shame that we're kicking ourselves with this. It is not good for consumer choice, and it's not good economically.
Well, gentlemen, I think that will bring us to our end. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your story. Thank you for doing what you do and bringing these not only wonderful wines that we get to drink, but these wonderful stories of the people that make them. And hopefully in the near future, we will be going back to restaurants in some aspect to enjoy them by the glass. And I don't know, hopefully, Roy, maybe you'll write another book about finding new properties in the near future, and we get to enjoy that as well. But otherwise, Max, you got anything before we get out of here?
Well, yeah, to our listeners and to anybody else, before we get out of here, I just wanted to mention Proof Alcohol Ice Cream one time before we leave, and that think differently about your dessert and enjoy Proof Alcohol Ice Cream, where you can buy that at the Triangle Wine Co. or at any Lowe's or Harris Teeter in North Carolina. Shipping you ice cream to everyone might be a little bit of a challenge to make sure it's still frozen when it gets to you, but I assure you, when you're in North Carolina or South Carolina for that matter, you can definitely partake in some delicious Proof Alcohol ice cream, things like coconut rum or bourbon caramel, strawberry moonshine. All of those are available at proofalcoholicecream.com or at Lowe's or Harris Teeter or Triangle Wine Company. So I just wanted to give them a quick little plug before we get out of here. Matt, what else you got?
Well, like we said earlier, go to your restaurant or go to your local wine shop, look for Vintage 59 on the back, and you will drink very merrily.
Thanks for listening to the NC F&B podcast. And if you've stuck with us this long, review us on iTunes, and remember, 5 stars are encouraged.